Hello, everyone. I'm Dr. Georges Benjamin. I'm the Executive Director at the American Public Health Association in Washington, D.C. I want to welcome you here to this exciting panel. We're going to talk a bit about the Clean Air Act and climate change for the 21st century. And as you can see, we have an amazing panel here for you. And just to remind you what the stakes are from a health perspective. I remind everyone that Los Angeles used to be very smoggy prior to the Clean Air Act. And after the Clean Air Act, of course, the air is much cleaner. The air is much safer to breathe. There was a time when previously you go out to run and people literally have to put face masks on, but for a different reason than we're putting face masks on today. And had to take particulate matter out of their mouths because of the real challenges we had with our air. Climate change has, of course, changed a lot of what we're seeing. This is, many of you, I think, seen these photos of people in San Francisco doing the fires that have been perpetuated by a warming planet. Looking out their windows, and literally the light made the air orange. And this was really a stark reminder a visual reminder of the real challenges that we have with climate change. Now, we certainly have made some progress, as you saw there from the previous picture of Los Angeles. But I just remind us we still have a long way to go. We still have too many plants that are spewing toxic pollution in the air, and so that we have work to do. So with that, I'm going to now turn to our illustrious panel. Again, we have 4 amazing speakers here to talk to you today about this issue of clean air and climate change as we look towards the 21st century. So I'll turn to our first panelist, which is Deborah Brown, who's the Chief Mission Officer at the American Lung Association.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin. It is an honor to speak today alongside a panel of such esteemed colleagues, and I want to focus my remarks on how we are seeing climate change impact air quality, not as a future threat, but just right now. Every year for the past 21 years, the American Lung Association has issued a State of the Air report, which is our annual National Air Quality Report Card. And in this report, the American Lung Association takes the complex information about air pollution and translates that into an easier to understand report card to help people learn about the local air quality and better protect themselves and their families. While everyone is at risk from breathing air pollution, even healthy adults, we like to say that someone in every family is at a higher risk, including children, older adults, people who work outdoors, and individuals with pre-existing health conditions. Over the years, the State of Air report has documented the success of the Clean Air Act. For years, the results showed that air quality around the nation was improving since the report began back in 1999. That progress is because of measures to clean up pollution that were put in place under the Clean Air Act. However, over the past 4 years, the report shows a disturbing trend of America's air quality actually getting worse. The main culprit is climate change. Climate change drives the conditions that increase harmful air pollutants. Rising temperatures lead to an increase in the formation of ground level ozone pollution, and climate change is making wildfires more frequent and intense, resulting in more particle pollution from the smoke. This year, the State of the Air report found that the number of people living in counties with unhealthy air increased to nearly 150 million. Nearly 5 in 10 Americans live in counties that have monitored unhealthy ozone, particle pollution, or both. This year, our report also showed how the burden of air pollution is not evenly shared. We know that many communities of color face a disproportionate risk from both air pollution and health impacts from climate change. State of the Air 2020 found that people of color are 1.5 times more likely to live in a county that has a failing grade. We also know that people of color face a greater risk from the health harms of air pollution for a number of reasons. They may face greater exposure to pollution because of factors ranging from racism and residential segregation to class bias to housing market dynamics and land cost. Further, some communities of color have higher rates of certain health conditions like asthma and diabetes that may put them at a greater risk. What's more, we've seen that the COVID-19 pandemic has exacerbated health inequities and forced people to contend with multiple threats to their lung health at once. These health inequities are unacceptable. The good news is that we clean up polluting sources to address climate change. We can see immediate health benefits from cleaning up other air pollutants at the same time. But we need to place health at the center of these cleanup efforts and ensure that no community gets left behind. We can't protect public health if we allow the dirtiest plants to keep polluting and continue to harm the communities nearby. That's why it is so critical that the Clean Air Act's tools remain intact, funded, and enforced. The law is at its core a public health law. We need tools in the Clean Air Act to ensure that we protect all Americans from the dangers of air pollution. There's so much work to do and no time to spare, especially if we want to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. As the nation considers solutions to address the climate change and clean up air pollution, there are pitfalls to avoid. We must not trade away clean air authority in exchange for climate policies. The American Lung Association opposes legislation that blocks, delays, removes, or weakens the Clean Air Act authority to limit criteria pollutants, toxics, carbon, methane, and other greenhouse gases. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Deborah. I'd now like to hear some opening remarks from Dr. Susan Annenberg. Dr. Annenberg is the Associate Professor in Environmental and Occupational Health and Global Health at the George Washington University, the Milken Institute School of Public Health. Dr. Annenberg.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, and good afternoon to everyone. I want to thank the organizers for inviting me to be a part of this panel. And what I'd like to do is share my perspectives from my current position as a public health researcher, but also one that's informed by the early part of my career spent at the EPA, estimating health benefits of air regulations. You know, it's hard to dispute the success of the Clean Air Act when you look at the quality of the air that we're breathing right now compared to what was in the air in 1970. You know, thanks to the Clean Air Act, my kids are breathing air that, and I looked this up, that has half as much fine particulate matter in it as when the record started in the year 2000, and about 1/3 less ground level ozone as in 1980 when that record started. My kids are 7, 5, and 1 years old now, and they've only experienced a handful of bad air days in DC, a city that was known for poor air quality throughout the early 2000s. And yet, I'm going to lay out 3 important challenges that we have for achieving clean air in the 21st century. The first challenge is that our national ambient air quality standards are not tight enough. While the Clean Air Act has successfully brought down pollution levels on average across the whole US, pollution levels are still causing health effects at very low levels. In fact, outdoor air pollution is considered the 8th leading risk factor in the US, responsible for over 100,000 premature deaths each year. And this is a dramatic underestimate because these estimates only consider fine particulate matter and ozone. They don't include a variety of other pollutants or a variety of health outcomes beyond the 6 that are included in that estimate. Those health outcomes include things like asthma and preterm birth and low birth weight, impairment of cognitive development, and contributions to cognitive decline, and many others. My research has shown that traffic-related air pollution contributes up to about 1/3 of new asthma cases among kids in US cities. This isn't just asthma exacerbation, but new and, might I add, preventable cases of asthma. Many of these health effects are occurring at levels below the national ambient air quality standards. So air pollution has not been solved in the US, and it continues to be a top public health risk factor. And because air pollution can contribute to COVID-19 severity, we can consider mitigating air pollution to be an important approach for making us more resilient to unforeseen health challenges in the future. The second challenge, air quality has also not improved equitably. Communities of color continue to experience higher air pollution levels than white communities. My research group has been using satellite observations to study the changes in traffic-related air pollution during COVID-19 lockdowns. And we found dramatic differences in levels of nitrogen dioxide, or NO2, between the most white and least white census tracts across the US. Now that's not surprising. We've known for a long time that communities of color experience higher air pollution levels. What was surprising to me anyway, was that during COVID-19, when passenger vehicle traffic dropped about 50%, the gap in NO2 exposure between the most white and least white communities actually got smaller. But our analysis also revealed something that was not just surprising, but actually really alarming in my opinion. NO2 levels in the least white communities during lockdowns exceeded the levels that the most white communities experienced pre-lockdowns. In other words, after passenger vehicle traffic dropped by half, the least white census tracts had higher NO2 levels compared with the most white census tracts before the pandemic started. So we're still dealing with a great divide in air pollution exposure between white communities and communities of color. Now let's discuss the third key challenge, and that is climate change. I mentioned earlier that my kids are breathing substantially less particulate matter and ozone than I did when I was their age. And yet they were born at 398, 403, and 410 parts per million CO2. That's a 20% increase compared to the air that I was breathing when I was born. Climate change is making wildfires more frequent and larger in the West, as we've seen play out dramatically and tragically across California and Oregon over the past few weeks. It's drying out the soil in the Southwest, contributing to more airborne dust and dust storms. Throughout the Midwest, climate change is contributing to more ozone formation. So even though we're on a trajectory of decreasing anthropogenic emissions, it's going to be harder to attain the national ambient air quality standards in the future, just because of these increases in quote unquote natural emissions. In fact, our research has estimated that these natural sources could become dominant contributors to air pollution in the future. So actually we need a better term for these air pollution sources because they're not natural anymore. They're increasingly affected by anthropogenic climate change. So how do we ensure that the air is safe to breathe now and in the future, given the interconnectedness of the air quality and climate systems? We need to shift our historical focus. The success we've achieved thus far has come mainly from end-of-pipe technological controls like scrubbers on power plants and diesel particulate filters and catalytic converters. These are engineering controls that they have dramatically reduced air pollution, but they haven't affected CO2. To meet the challenges of climate change, engineering controls are not enough. They are essential, but they're not enough. We need to shift mobility from personal vehicle ridership to walking and cycling and carbon-free public transportation. We need dramatic improvements in energy efficiency. And we need to generate the electricity we need without burning fossil fuels. In short, we need to burn less stuff. Most importantly, fossil fuel, but also biofuels. Anytime we burn anything, regardless of the end use, we are releasing both air pollutants and greenhouse gases. By burning less, we make the air safer to breathe, we avoid climate change, we're improving physical fitness and overall health, we reduce environmental health disparities, and we can make us more resilient to unforeseen health risk factors like COVID-19. It's not just a win-win, it's a win-win, win-win-win. So with that, I'll send it back over to Dr. Benjamin.
Thank you very, very, very much. So our next panelist is an attorney. It's Carlson. She's a Shirley Shapiro Professor of Environmental Law, the faculty director at the Emmett Institute on Climate Change and the Environment at the UCLA School of Law. Ms. Carlson.
Thank you, Dr. Benjamin, and thanks to my incredibly impressive fellow panelists. So I, of course, am sitting in Los Angeles, which most of you probably think of as the most polluted city in the country. And I want to take a few minutes to talk about the ways in which the Clean Air Act has really been the most extraordinary public health success in probably United States history, focusing on Los Angeles and focusing on some numbers. While recognizing that problems remain, and I think Susan and Deb did a terrific job spelling those out, I don't want to lose sight of the fact that we have a lot of work to do, but I do want to just talk about how extraordinary the Clean Air Act has been, and then use it to think about mechanisms that we might learn from in our experience with the Clean Air Act to tackle climate change. So let me just start with some numbers. So to put this all in perspective, I was 10 years old in 1970. I grew up in Southern California in Orange County. My childhood experience was one of burning eyes, painful lungs virtually all of the time. My sort of vision of Southern California was either white or brown skies, and that was just a regular part of my childhood and my existence. But let me put some numbers on that for you. So in 1970, when the Clean Air Act, of course, was passed 50 years ago, Los Angeles experienced 240 total violations of the ozone standard, which at the time was 50% higher than it is today. So those violations were for 125 parts per billion or higher. But that may sound like a lot. It was much worse than that. 225 days we experienced what Southern Californians came to know as stage 1 smog alerts. That was when you were supposed to curtail outdoor activity, you weren't supposed to play sports, etc. We of course ignored those alerts because 220 days is a lot of days, and we would have been living inside had we actually paid attention to the smog alert system. That was at 200 parts per billion. That was a stage 1 smog alert. We had 135 days over 350 parts per billion. That was a stage 2 smog alert. And we had 9 days above 500 parts per billion. Just to put that into perspective, in 2018, actually since 1998, we've experienced no stage 1, stage 2, or stage 3 smog alerts. In 2018, we had 10 days above 125 parts per billion. That's in contrast to the 240 days of ozone violations above that amount in 1970. And it's also worth noting that because the Southern California basin is so large, the violations are actually dispersed in different places. Most of the ozone violations occur in the eastern part of the basin. That means that San Bernardino and Riverside counties, if you know the geography of Southern California, experience the worst air pollution. There are big environmental justice concerns about that. But it's also worth noting that Los Angeles County, which is home to 9 million people and a very, very diverse population, experienced just 1 ozone violation in 2018. Pretty extraordinary accomplishment, and remember that's at a much lower ozone standard. Ozone's not the only pollutant, of course, that the Clean Air Act tackles. In 1970, Los Angeles had 203 days of carbon monoxide violations. Actually, in 1964, the state had a standard. There were 366 violations, 366 because it was a leap year. So every day of the year we experienced carbon monoxide violations. In 2018, we've had 0, and that's been true for about almost 20 years. Nitrogen dioxide in 1970, we had 205 violations. 2018, we had 0. Lead wasn't considered a national ambient air quality standard criteria pollutant in 1970. That didn't happen until later, thanks to great lawsuits by great environmental organizations. But it's really important to talk about the extraordinary accomplishments of getting lead out of gasoline and therefore, for the most part, getting it out of air. So in 1980, Los Angeles, like virtually every city in the country, violated the lead standard every single quarter of the year. And lead violations were on the order of 50 times higher than what they are today. That translated into real and serious exposure for kids. So in 1980, kids on average had lead levels that were about 1,000% higher than the lead levels that kids in Flint, Michigan experienced as a result of exposure to lead in their drinking water. I always tell my students when I'm teaching air pollution law that my generation on average lost about 4 to 5 IQ points as a result of lead exposure. Today, lead levels in kids are just a tiny, tiny fraction of what we experienced. And that's the direct result of banning lead in gasoline, which was the direct result of the development of the catalytic converter as standard technology on cars. Catalytic converters couldn't run properly with lead in gasoline, leading the EPA to ban lead in gas. That's a health effect that has saved lives, it has saved brains, it has saved kidneys, and it's been exported across the world as catalytic technology is standard on most cars. One other pollutant to mention, and that is fine particulate matter, not actually listed as a criteria pollutant until 1997. In 2000, the South Coast District, of which Los Angeles is a part, experienced 120 days of violations of the fine particulate standard. In 2018, we experienced 9. That includes the 4th of July. Of course, climate change is changing that with wildfires, and we don't always count those for complicated regulatory reasons. But nevertheless, these are extraordinary accomplishments. One more little factoid, and then let me describe why I think the Clean Air Act offers us important lessons for climate change. About a week and a half ago, 2 weeks ago, Los Angeles was experiencing an incredible heat wave. It was on the order of 120 degrees in the San Fernando Valley. We also experienced the worst ozone day since 1994. Nevertheless, the amount of ozone we experienced was under the stage 1 smog alert standard. Remember, we used to have 220 days a year of stage 1 smog alerts. And so that just tells you, relatively speaking, how extraordinary the accomplishments are of the Clean Air Act. Okay, let me wrap up by suggesting that there are at least 4, actually probably many more lessons that we might take from the Clean Air Act to use in our fight against climate change. These are going to be general lessons, they're not specific policies. The first is think big and think ambitiously. One of the really important provisions of the Clean Air Act in 1970 was to set national ambient air quality standards based on public health, not on cost, and to require auto manufacturers to cut tailpipe emissions by 90% in just 3 or 4 years. We didn't accomplish achieving those standards in the time frame, but it sure set off an extraordinary regulatory apparatus that led to catalytic converter technology, led to all sorts of ways in which we have cleaned up the air dramatically through cleaning up our fuels, cleaning up diesel, and so forth. Ambition is really important. If we shoot for the stars, maybe we'll hit the moon. If we shoot under that, we're not going to meet our climate targets. So that's one suggestion. A second suggestion is requiring the updating of emissions reductions required, something like the NAAQS process through the Clean Air Act. EPA, as you know, is required every 5 years to update national ambient air quality standards, to add new ones if necessary, and it does so based on a very sophisticated scientific assessment. That has led to huge public health gains. We learn things about pollutants that we didn't know previously. EPA used to not think particulate matter caused a lot of health problems. It didn't understand the toxicity of lead, especially in kids. As scientists got more sophisticated, our standards changed, and that's a really important part of the Clean Air Act. The third lesson, I think, from the Clean Air Act that's extraordinarily important is let California lead where it can. The California experience in regulating mobile sources, diesel trucks, cars, et cetera, has led to extraordinary reductions in pollution that I think it's safe to say would not have occurred had the federal government been left on its own. There's a relationship that exists where California leads and then the federal government follows suit if California is successful. That's a provision I think we should follow and keep in place with respect to climate change. And the final recommendation I would make is that we need to continue to allow citizen suits. Citizen suits, as part of the Clean Air Act, have been extraordinarily important in holding the federal government's feet to the fire and ensuring that national ambient air quality standards get set and get strengthened, in finding that greenhouse gas emissions are pollutants under the Clean Air Act, and on and on and on. I think just as California's role has been critical to the success of the Clean Air Act, so too has citizen suit participation, something we don't always think about, but which I think is extraordinarily important and I think should be a crucial part of tackling climate change as we go forward. I will stop there and thank you all for being here, including a number of my students.
Thank you, Ms. Carlson. Our next panelist is Mr. John Haynes. Mr. Haynes is the program manager for the health and air quality applications at the Applied Sciences program at the NASA Earth Science Division. Mr. Haynes.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Benjamin, and thanks to everybody for allowing me to speak with such a wonderful panel today at this great celebration. I'm actually going to stop my video here because I do want to share some slides with all of you. I want to start here with NASA's Earth fleet of current operating missions, because this is where it really all starts for NASA Earth Science, with our constellation of over 20 satellites and sensors in low Earth orbit that are continuously monitoring Earth's weather, climate, and environment for research and applications purposes. This constellation is the largest civilian remote sensing constellation anywhere in the globe, and it would not be possible without all of our domestic and international partners that you can see listed there via their national flags or their domestic logos. Now, we are literally downloading terabytes of Earth observations every day to our ground network systems. And these observations show how the Earth is changing across many different types of observations, many that are very important for air quality. So let's just take a look a bit at those air quality observations. What you're seeing here is observations from the Aura spacecraft, which was launched in 2004, and in particular, its sensor on board known as the Ozone Monitoring Instrument, or OMI. As OMI's name suggests, it does monitor ozone, but it also looks at other criteria pollutants, such as nitrogen dioxide and sulfur dioxide. As you well know, nitrogen dioxide is a pollutant, unhealthy to breathe on its own, and contributes to the formation of unhealthy levels of surface ozone pollution, primarily emitted from burning, from tailpipes, from smokestacks. Well, the ozone monitoring instrument on board OMI has shown a 20 to 50% decrease over most of the US from 2005 to 2016 in nitrogen dioxide emissions, including in Washington, D.C., where a 50% decrease was seen. This, of course, is not by accident, and this is a good news story that we are publicizing here, but needs to be told across the country. It was all because of the regulations and policies promulgated under the Clean Air Act that we're celebrating here today. While we have seen those large decreases in NO2 and other criteria pollutants between 2005 and to 2012, we did see a plateauing of the change in the later years of this decade. It was mentioned earlier by Dr. Carlson about stage 1 alerts and things like that. Well, again, being nitrogen dioxide is a contributing factor to the development of surface ozone. I am proud to say, and we should all be proud to say, that we have not had a red alert day for ozone in the Washington, D.C. metropolitan area in almost 9 years. And that, again, is a huge accomplishment directly attributable to the Clean Air Act that we're celebrating here today. Now, these Earth observations such as these are so important that I'm proud to also say that the EPA has included these satellite observations in their Air Trends report every year since 2016 as part of the National Ambient Air Quality Standards chapter. Of course, this year is a year like no other, and we are being able to observe the changes across our Earth system that are being caused by COVID-19 and its mitigation efforts in many different ways. One of those is through air quality. Once again, we're taking a look here at observations from the Ozone Monitoring Instrument on Aura, as well as the European Space Agency's TROPOMI instrument, and again looking at nitrogen dioxide and how it has changed. Because of COVID-19 mitigation efforts, including much increased telework, other types of economic lockdowns to decrease the spread of the virus, we are seeing large decreases in nitrogen dioxide where these mitigation measures have been introduced. You're looking here at the northeastern corridor of the United States. Looking at March 2020 on the right-hand side of the screen compared to the 4-year average in March from the same instrument across the northeastern corridor, again showing very large decreases in nitrogen dioxide as people's travel and other habits were severely curtailed. Now, these observations are available on a NASA website at the bottom of the screen at Goddard Space Flight Center, where you can compare NO2 from 2020 to any time in the past 4 years averaged at the same 2-week period. But even further than that, showing the large amount of international collaboration that's going on to tackle this global crisis. NASA has joined with the European Space Agency, as well as the Japanese Space Agency, to launch a COVID-19 Earth Observation Dashboard, whose link is also at the bottom of the screen. These observations from Aura, from TROPOMI of nitrogen dioxide and other criteria pollutants are part of that dashboard. But there are also a myriad of other economic, agricultural, and environmental indicators that are available to the public on that dashboard in order to, again, see how the Earth system is changing in response to our efforts to curtail the COVID-19 pandemic. As was mentioned, there are certainly other air quality crises going on in the world caused by natural events, including wildland fires. As we know right now, severe wildfires are raging across the western United States, particularly in California. The NASA has worked very closely with our partners at the U.S. Forest Service, NOAA, the National Park Service, among others, to develop smoke outlooks that incorporate Earth observations from our satellite constellation. These smoke outlooks not only give the location of fires in the western United States, which we can observe through our infrared sensors, but also indicate where smoke plumes are existing from these fires, where those smoke plumes will propagate over the next 24 to 48 hours, and then ties that to air quality indices as dictated by the EPA for communities affected by the plumes. As you may have heard on the news earlier this year, the worst Saharan dust event in 50 years impacted the Eastern Caribbean, including the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico in June. These dust storms certainly adversely impact air quality, but also have a large impact on human health. NASA has joined with the University of Puerto Rico Medical Sciences Center, as well as the EPA Caribbean region and the National Weather Service in San Juan, Puerto Rico, to develop an early warning and forecasting system for these adverse air quality events. I'm glad to say that that system was first launched in its prototype form just before the severe dust event in June. You'll see at the bottom some of the satellite observations that we use to be able to detect when these dust plumes are crossing the Atlantic, including data known as aerosol optical depth, which we can use as a proxy for particulate matter 2.5 micron. But the proof certainly is on the ground. As you can see, images from San Juan from June 20th versus June 23rd, showing how much the air quality had been degraded across the Commonwealth. We have recently actually augmented this project because, again, of the link to human health. We've augmented it with the University of Puerto Rico Medical Sciences Center to investigate how these adverse air quality events may impact the susceptibility of human populations to COVID-19, as well as possible severity of the disease for those that do contract it. And finally, I want to end here looking again to the future as we continue to look across the 21st century. Yes, we have the most robust constellation of Earth-observing satellites seen anywhere in the world, seen anywhere in history. But we are also continuing to have to push that envelope and keep it the most robust Earth-observing constellation by adding new satellites to the mix. And we're very excited about this air quality satellite that will be launched in 2022, known as TEMPO, with its slogan of monitoring the air we breathe hour by hour. TEMPO will be able to look at the greater North America and observe every hour of the daylight such criteria pollutants as ozone, nitrogen dioxide, and formaldehyde at a higher resolution than we've ever seen before. It will form a global air quality constellation with the European Space Agency and the Korean Space Agency in order to look at these criteria pollutants across the entire Northern Hemisphere and see how these pollutants are transmitted across the hemisphere based, of course, on weather patterns. The US EPA and NOAA are part of this science team. Again, the instrument is complete, and we're looking forward to its launch in 2022. And with that, I will stop there and stop sharing. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. And if I could have all the panelists to cut their cameras back on and they can open up their mics. Let me just say that thank you. But early in the symposium, California's Community Air Protection Program was brought up. And the program designates disadvantaged communities for air quality data studies. For any of the panelists, what more can be done to address traditional air pollution and the impacts of climate change at the neighborhood level? Anne, go ahead.
Sure, so I'm happy to start. So there has been a conversation I know earlier, although I was teaching, so I didn't get a chance to hear it, about California's AB 617, which is a really interesting approach to thinking about air pollution, not from a big basin kind of ambient perspective, but really trying to monitor sources at a much smaller neighborhood scale and to try to figure out which communities are most affected by pollution hotspots and then what to do about that pollution. And I think what's especially interesting about that is there are really two things that are interesting. One is, as I said already, scale. To stop thinking about air pollution in quite such sort of large scale ways with big air pollution basins, but also to really look at detailed granular data about what is causing air pollution. And it turns out that at least initially, the monitoring that's been done in communities that have been designated for extra monitoring under this bill show that communities can experience very different sources of air pollution. So East LA, for example, it experiences the most intense particulate pollution from trains. But communities at the port experience the most intense air pollution from both shipping and the various off-road vehicles that transport freight around the ports. that would suggest very different regulatory strategies depending upon what's causing the source of the pollution. And I don't think we've studied pollution quite in that way in the past. And I think it offers a really promising way, something that could be extended beyond California, to think about hotspot pollution in communities of color and low-income communities in particular. It might be possible that the Clean Air Act could be implemented in a way that kind of uses AB 617 as a model. The only thing I will say is that it is resource intensive. It takes a lot of extra monitoring. California has a lot of requirements, very appropriate requirements for community participation that I think are integral to trying to figure out how to tackle neighborhood-based pollution. And then the other thing is that transition to an electric fleet. I think one of the earlier panelists before our panel suggested could have really profound consequences, not only for climate change, but also for air pollution. Transportation, certainly in California, remains the leading source of air pollution. I think that's true for most urban areas around the country. And so transitioning to a zero emission vehicle fleet, not just in the passenger sector, but also commercial sector, trucks, drayage equipment, and so forth, would make a profound difference in air pollution and the remaining air pollution problems that we face.
Okay. John, if you had anything you wanted to add to that, or Susan, you did? Go ahead.
Sure. Yeah, thank you. Well, I disagree with, just agree, not disagree. I just agree with what Anne's saying, and would add that we have the tools now to be monitoring air pollution at much finer resolutions than when the Clean Air Act started or when the amendments were here. I mean, we just heard John talk about the amazing revolution in satellite data and satellite technology. We also have a massive, improvement in chemical transport modeling, these computer-based atmospheric models that, when I was just starting my studies as a PhD student, had really coarse spatial scales. We would sort of model the atmosphere at 200 kilometers by 200 kilometer grid boxes. And now we can get down to 1 kilometer by 1 kilometer, even finer. So we, with the satellite data, with computer technology, and then some of the work that one of the panelists was talking about in the earlier session about Google Street View mapping cars being outfitted with air pollution sensors and driving every street. This was done in Oakland, California, for example. These can reveal really important hotspots of air pollution that we don't get with the very few sparsely located central monitors that EPA network has. And then the other thing I would add is that it's not just where concentrations are highest, but also the vulnerability of the population. So we have to consider not just the levels of pollution, but the disease rates that are ongoing in the population. And those, as we know, can vary dramatically between population subgroups geographically and between different population categorizations. So accounting for both the pollution levels and the health status of the population is really critical.
And Dr. Benjamin, I just had one thing to add. When we're talking about this issue, also it's very important to think about the issue of health in the developing world. We have another satellite that I didn't mention in my initial remarks, but it's also very important and really groundbreaking that will be launched in also 2022. That's called Maya. It's the multi-angle imager for aerosols. But this mission is the first time that NASA has ever partnered with epidemiologists and health organizations to use space-based data to study human health and improve lives. And Maya is actually a targetable satellite that will be able to target megacities across the Earth to observe particulate matter types. And the cities that are being targeted are those ones that have large health cohort studies. So they're going to attempt to correlate the particulate matter observations we're going to get from Maya with these health cohort studies to look at issues of adverse birth outcomes, cardiovascular, respiratory disease, and the like. And of course, many of these megacities are in the developing world. So this is going to be a very exciting a new mission coming up 2 years from now that we are again in partnership with agencies such as the CDC on.
Thank you. There's one other question here. Is the issue is how do we really address this issue of air pollution at the same time we're trying to utilize these tools to address climate change. There's clearly a co-benefit there by some of the things that we're trying to do. Does anyone want to talk a bit about that?
Well, from the Clean Air Act, certainly does provide a lot of tools, and the American Lung Association knows that those tools provide key national and enforceable requirements for reducing emissions that cause climate change. And so the Clean Air Act gives EPA the authority and responsibility to reduce climate pollution while also giving significant flexibility to states to go further than federal requirements. And so smart regulations like the mercury and air toxic standards, cleanup of methane from oil and gas operations, and cleaner car and truck regulations can be win-wins. So we know that they can significantly reduce toxic pollutants, precursors, ozone and particulate matter, as well as CO2 and other greenhouse gases. And so I think it's really important that, we indicate the American Lung Association is really just opposed to any legislative proposals that would block, delay, or repeal Clean Air Act authority to address air pollution.
Great, thank you. And recognizing that we've had many attempts to use the Clean Air Act to regulate greenhouse gases, such as the Clean Power Plan and that California waiver. What are some of the other avenues that are being considered, and how should we, any new administration seek to address this?
I can offer some thoughts that, I think historically, when the Clean Air Act has been used to regulate greenhouse gases or air pollutants, there's other pollutants that are not the target of the regulation are considered the co-benefits of the regulation. I would suggest that a move towards thinking rather than co-benefits, thinking in terms of multiple benefits would be useful. Anytime, as I mentioned, anytime we burn less stuff, we're reducing both air pollution and greenhouse gases, and these are happening simultaneously. It does not need to be one, being sort of a primary goal, the other being a secondary goal. It's, in a way, sort of a bit of semantics. These are multiple effects of the same action. So considering that these systems here, air quality, climate change, public health, all these societal systems are interconnected. These do not exist in isolation. It would be beneficial for us to be thinking about how they all interact with each other and consider the multiple benefits of any action we can take. And then finally, partnering with state and local organizations and urban planners and others who have, who have the ability to make decisions on sort of a micro scale. Some of the efforts that DC is undertaking, for example, that we heard about earlier, these can have really massive benefits for public health in multiple ways, by reducing greenhouse gases, by reducing air pollution, by improving physical fitness and avoiding the health disparities that we're currently facing. So partnering at multiple, geographical scales would be really beneficial as well.
Dr. Benjamin, can I just follow up on that? So your question was, what tools can we use outside of the Clean Air Act? And one thing I think it's important to stress is that we shouldn't depend only on the Clean Air Act. As great a statute as it is, there's some potential legal vulnerabilities for using that statute aggressively. I'm happy to talk about that. I think that's particularly true in light of the changing composition of the Supreme Court. But I just wanted to offer a few. One is, as we face this economic catastrophe that has resulted from the pandemic, investments in infrastructure seem like an obvious opportunity to really think about the climate benefits that can result. So just a couple of examples. We tend to focus a lot on new vehicles. Old vehicles remain on the road for a long time and they pollute in lots of ways. Getting them off the road or retrofitting them can produce multiple benefits, to use Susan's term, both for air pollution and for climate. You could imagine a better designed kind of cash for clunkers program or money for retrofitting buses, trucks, et cetera. Incentives for retiring trucks and purchasing either more fuel efficient or eventually electric trucks. Investing in electric vehicle infrastructure is going to be really, really important if we're really going to transform our vehicle fleet away from internal combustion engine. And huge investments in energy efficiency, not just new building standards, but existing buildings, something that the Green New Deal has embraced. So there's lots of ways to be thinking about climate policy that are not just reliant on existing authority under the Clean Air Act. Of course, if Congress is willing to act to do things like adopt a clean energy standard or more than that, that obviously would be a great way to go. But again, infrastructure spending may provide a particularly promising avenue for maybe even some bipartisan cooperation.
Okay. Let me go to John. John, there's a question in the question box. It says, how will the best satellite data give us a good handle on the distribution of ground level particulate matter 2.5? And can this be used to identify areas with high local exposures?
Yes, thanks for the question, Dr. Benjamin. Thanks for the question from the audience. Certainly, PM 2.5 and other particulate matter sizes are one of our focus areas when we're talking about air quality and satellite data. We can't measure PM 2.5 directly. We have to measure it through something known as aerosol optical depth, which I mentioned earlier when I was discussing the Puerto Rican Saharan dust event, where actually the satellite is looking at a column in the atmosphere and determining how much aerosol loading is occurring in that column. And then we can use that as a proxy for PM 2.5. But I want to make clear that satellite data is a very important piece of this air quality puzzle. But it's not the panacea and the answer to everything, because you have to be looking at the Earth not only as a system, but monitoring the Earth as a system. So it's extremely important, as was mentioned earlier by Dr. Annenberg and others, to have the ground monitoring data, the ground truth data involved in this to help calibrate our models and our products so that we can use those to get a better representative view of PM 2.5 across the globe. Because that's the great advantage of satellite data, is that it sees the entire globe. And we have a lot of ground data in the United States and in the developed world and in Western Europe, but there are many places across the world where there may be zero air quality sensors. And so we use the satellite data to get this representative viewpoint of pollution, including PM 2.5, but then we ground it in truth using those ground data, as well as aircraft data through our science campaigns as well. So it's all piece of that. All of it's a piece of that big jigsaw puzzle, if you will, to get the true view of what pollution is like across the planet.
There's another question here for any of the panelists. It says, in addition to shifting our air quality monitoring network to a more localized scale, there's also a need to identify the proportion of PM that's measured in nanometers. Those particles that are now, as we understand, that have a greater uptake and impact on the brain and other organs due to their size. Thermometers are few and far between in our network, but are necessary to characterize risk. Any comments on observations on this? So the idea is, how do we measure the really, really small particles and their impacts on the body? Any thoughts on that from the panel?
So I can talk about how we might regulate it, but I can't talk about how we might measure it. I have a legal answer, but not a scientific answer.
Okay, let's go for that.
Over the course of the 50-year history of the Clean Air Act, as we have learned more about the dangers of particular pollutants, EPA has responded with either tougher national ambient air quality standards or new national ambient air quality standards, or different ways of regulating pollutants that are, after all, very, very broadly defined in the Clean Air Act. That's what we know from Massachusetts versus EPA, that held that air pollutants include greenhouse gases. So there is an opportunity for regulatory action that doesn't require new legislation by Congress. I think it would be upheld even by the newly constituted, more conservative Supreme Court, if there were regulatory measures used to go after these ultrafine particles. EPA can also do a lot in terms of demanding that states engage in particular kinds of monitoring. So if the monitoring equipment is available, EPA can engage in a rulemaking that requires states or air districts to monitor. And there have been lots of battles over what you monitor, where you monitor, how you monitor, that tend to be kind of buried under the radar, but that are pretty powerful tools for understanding, what pollutants people are exposed to, and then what we might do about it from a regulatory perspective.
Well, you bring up an important point about the regulatory environment in which we're in, particularly with the EPA. In many ways, they've kind of backtracked a lot on some of the regulatory activity that they're doing. As you know, they've changed both the some of the guidelines around using prior research studies, as well as kind of looking at things differently from a cost perspective. I guess the fundamental question is anybody think we can change their mind in the short term? And then in the long term, assuming you have different regulators in place, how does one go about reestablishing those tools that really have served us well in the past? Susan?
But yeah, I could just offer a few thoughts. I think in the, the near term decisions are going to be what they are. The scientific advice to the EPA, the regulatory process is just essential and critical, and it's not happening right now. So we can get back to that by reintegrating science into the decision-making process at various standpoints. We have these extensive NAAQS reviews that are, go on in 5-year cycles, and there's multiple times at which scientific advisors are called upon to review and provide advice. That right now is, that had been happening throughout the history of the EPA, and right now is not happening to the degree that it used to. The underpinnings of all of these regulations is science. So I don't think you can understate the importance of scientific review and advice in the process.
Thank you. Anne?
So I'm just going to be bold and suggest that we're not going to see a lot of change unless it comes to the courts if the Trump administration retains power. I don't think we're going to persuade the Trump administration that, co-benefits in the Mercury rule are, a great idea. But the courts have already played a very important role in checking the regulatory excesses of the Trump administration. Some of that is procedural, but some of it is substantive, and I think that will continue. I don't think, for example, the courts are going to find that it's reasonable or appropriate to exclude co-benefits in cost-benefit analysis. And so I just think it's worth making that clear. A change in administration will make an extraordinary difference. A lot of rules and regulations are going to need to be rolled back and replaced, and that will be a slow process. I also think the decimation of EPA is a real issue, and we're going to need to think hard about how to, staff up the EPA back to, to levels where it can take on the extraordinary challenges the agency faces. But there is a big difference in who is in power here, and who is in power will make a huge difference to how we treat not just climate change, but air pollution and all sorts of other important environmental issues.
A major hole in policy today is in the climate change area. We obviously have these big wildfires that we're seeing in our western states. Now, as you know, many of these were considered really one-time events. And I would anticipate that we're going to see more of these as the planet warms with greater frequency, intensity, and certainly a longer burn season each and every year. We should anticipate these getting worse. So what's the regulatory framework that we need to put in place to address really the air quality non-attainment from sources like wildfires? Debbie, you want to take that on first?
Sure. Well, I think the public has a right to know when air pollution, irrespective of its sources, really threatens their health. And so your lungs don't care whether the air pollution you're breathing in is an exceptional event. And that's the way the law describes one-time events that don't count toward whether a community is meeting its clean air requirements. So It is why the American Lung Association in our State of the Air report does not ignore wildfire-related smoke when we calculate the grades for the quality of the community's air. We also know that the exceptional event processes has the potential to be targeted to avoid a cleanup separate from the wildfire issue. And so the dangerous air quality so many communities has faced this year due to wildfire smoke is just the latest illustration of the fact that air pollution does not respect a city or state boundary. And that's why we need the federal protections under the Clean Air Act and why federal climate action under the law is so critical.
Andy, you want to add to that?
Yeah, just I think that wildfire pollution poses a real challenge to regulators, in part because the traditional apparatus we use is to regulate sources of air pollution that are, tailpipes and smokestacks and so forth. And it's really hard to envision if you started counting wildfire exceedance days as going toward non-attainment. It's hard to know, do you make an air pollution agency a fire management agency? It's just a hard question. And so I think it's worth thinking about whether we should have an alternative regulatory means for figuring out how to at least reduce the risk of these exceedances through better fire management practices. Of course, tackling climate change is another way to try to reduce wildfire, but that's a long, slow process. So I think we need a new way of thinking about this regulatory question. I don't know what the answers are, but I think it poses challenges that are different from the kind of conventional regulatory means we've used to regulate air pollution.
I'll just add an additional perspective too, that when we have been, in the few instances where we have regulated greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, there have been cost benefit analyses, and the benefits of reducing CO2 emissions have not included things like the health impacts of smoke from wildfires. We are dramatically undercounting the benefits of regulating greenhouse gases, and that, as you know, would throw the whole cost benefit analysis, out of reality. So I think it's really important to be considering these multiple health benefits that would happen if we were to regulate greenhouse gases. And these are not a co-benefit, these are benefits. These are the health benefits that would come from reducing climate change.
Now, let me ask you, the tools that you have, your amazing satellites, is there any way for the satellite technology to help with early identification of these wildfires and maybe figuring out how we can address the scope of them before they get out of control?
Yes, thank you. Certainly. As I kind of briefly mentioned when I was discussing the wildfire smoke outlooks that we work with the U.S. Forest Service and the National Park Service, we have a sensor on orbit known as MODIS. It's actually on 2 of our satellites, that it has an infrared channel. And it's actually able to determine with its flybys twice a day the location of wildfires across the planet and submit that data in near real time to people here on the ground. And that data is used operationally by folks such as the U.S. Forest Service to identify when wildfires are beginning, particularly in very remote areas that they may not have fire spotters or what have you, to be able to report it. So it's a combination of looking for the location of the wildfires, and then we're talking about the air quality, other observations we have, the smoke plumes, and modeling of how those will propagate over the next hours to days. And again, this is all, we work very closely hand in glove with agencies such as the Forest Service, NOAA, the Park Service, and others on these issues. And like I said, including using that satellite data in near real time right now as we speak, in identifying the hot spots in California and how to target those as well.
Thank you very, very much. And a question for you. A lot of the forests that are burning are really federal property versus property that the state, has primary jurisdictions on. How do we, in this era of federalism, how do we do that trade-off between who's responsible and raking the forest grounds and doing the management of the forests in a way that can mitigate, control burning, all the tools that we have to at least try to begin to mitigate some of these terrible fires?
I don't know if I have a great answer to that question, except to say that we need leadership from the federal government, and we need the federal government to believe that California, for example, is worthy of attention and not approbation. But you know, the problems are they're really complex. They're about federal land management. They're about land use decisions that get made. They're about insurance coverage for fire. They're about building standards. You know, just that they're about fire management practices. You know, it just goes on and on and on. So, you know, all I can really say is that no one entity of government can do this alone. I think we need a really massive sort of effort to try to figure out how, in the short run, as temperatures continue to increase and as wildfire continues to be such a big risk, how we at least manage and adapt to that new reality, because it's going to happen. And you know, all our efforts to mitigate greenhouse gases are not going to change the next 20 years and our fire experience. That's not a great answer, but if nothing else, we need a lot more federal leadership on this question.
No, I think it tells me that we need a really strong federal, state, local partnership with an understanding that we are in an evolving world. Tragically, we've not done enough to address climate change. It's impacting our health today through a variety of mechanisms. It's certainly making the air less safe to breathe. It's better than it was before, but it's still not good enough. And we have a variety of tools, from activism to scientific tools to the law, to the extent we can use the law. And as you pointed out, several of you, we have tools that we can use to incentivize the change that we want to see as we go forward. But at the end of the day, it does require leadership. And without leadership, you can't get anywhere. You have to know where you're going and have someone to lead you there as a way to doing that. I think we're getting to pretty much to the end of our panel today. Let me, folks, just thank our amazing panelists, Dr. Ann Carlson, Mr. John Haynes, and Dr. Susan Annenberg for their amazing thoughts today, and Deb Brown for the American Lung Association. Thank you very much for your time here today. I want to remind the folks that are watching this, the webinar, that we have a 10-minute break. And I think we're going to break from 3:50 to 4 p.m. when we'll go to our next panel, which is an important panel talking about lessons from the past 50 years. With that, I want to thank you. And this is Georges Benjamin and our panel signing off.